Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is to take source material and really find the essential insights.
And today we're digging into a pretty significant topic, the life of Prophet Muhammad. We're focusing specifically on one detailed YouTube source. It's titled The Miraculous Life of Prophet Muhammad, the first Islamic AI documentary 4K.
Right, in this source, it really takes us on this sweeping journey through history, doesn't it? It covers the Kaaba, this whole lineage of prophets, and then zeroes in on Muhammad's life, really emphasizing miracles and divine guidance throughout.
Exactly. So our aim here is to unpack the specific story told by this particular source. We'll explore the key figures, the events, the concepts it presents, just to understand the flow of history and belief as it's laid out right here.
Okay, sounds good. So let's dive into this source material. What jumps out first?
All right, well, the source immediately kind of sets the scene with the Kaaba in Mecca. It places it right at the very beginning of its narrative about prophethood, describing it as the very first house of worship on earth, built originally by Prophet Adam.
Prophet Adam. Wow, okay, so that pushes its history way, way back. How does the source explain, its journey after Adam? Through history.
Well, the source says its history was interrupted pretty dramatically during Prophet Noah's time, the Great Flood. It apparently disappeared then.
Disappeared, like completely gone.
Seems so, according to this telling. But centuries later, Prophet Abraham, following God's command apparently, found its forgotten ruins, and he rebuilt it right on the exact same spot with his son, Ishmael.
Ishmael, right? Okay. So incredibly ancient foundation, lost, then rediscovered and rebuilt by Abraham. What state was it in just before Muhammad comes onto the scene?
Yeah, so the source describes this period where Abraham's original teachings, they were largely forgotten. The people in Mecca had sort of fallen into idolatry, unfortunately. They filled the Kaaba and the area around it with hundreds of idols.
So its original purpose was kind of lost.
Pretty much. Its significance as a place for worshiping one god had faded. But crucially, it remained physically on that same spot, sort of like a silent witness, waiting for change.
Huh. A silent witness. I like that. And the source then connects this history to this broad lineage of prophets.
Yes, exactly. It traces this line starting right from Adam and Eve, then through their son Seth, Enoch, and eventually Noah. And Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they're presented as the points where humanity kind of divided.
Okay. And how does Abraham fit into that longer story? According to this source, anyway.
Right. So the lineage continues from Shem, mentioning prophets like Hud, Shiloh, Lot, Shuaib, and then we get to Prophet Abraham. The source really highlights him as a central figure, a key patriarch for the Abrahamic religions, obviously.
And his lineage splits.
Correct. Through his two sons, Ishmael and Isaac.
Ah, okay. And these two sons, they lead to the lines of prophets that are probably more familiar to, many people listening.
Exactly. The source traces Isaac's line, which leads to Jacob, who's also known as Israel, right? And from him, the Israelites. This line includes a lot of well-known prophets. Moses, for instance, the source actually calls him a fifth-degree great-grandson of Isaac.
Oh, interesting detail.
Yeah, and David, a fourth-degree great-grandson, then Solomon, and later on, Joachim, who is the father of Mary, which places Jesus then as a descendant of Isaac.
Okay, so that's the lineage through Isaac, Moses, David, Jesus. Where does Prophet Muhammad fit into this narrative, according to the source?
So Prophet Muhammad is presented as a descendant of Abraham's other son, Ishmael. Ishmael is highlighted as the father of the Arab people, the Ishmaelites. And the source makes this explicit point. Abraham is the common ancestor for this whole line of prophets, including both Jesus and Muhammad.
Right. And the source seems to specifically frame Jesus as like a precursor to Muhammad. What does his narrative say about Jesus' life and mission?
It gives a brief account. It says his teachings were revolutionary for the time, and they angered the established religious leaders and the Roman authorities. This apparently led to an order for his arrest.
And the betrayal by Judas is mentioned.
Yes, it mentions Judas, one of his companions, betraying him, disclosing his location, and after the arrest, the plan was crucifixion, which was, a standard Roman execution method then.
But this source, it presents a very different outcome for that planned crucifixion, doesn't it? Something pretty dramatic.
Yeah, this is where it describes what it calls a significant divine miracle. It presents God as being, beyond our understanding, free from space and time, acting independent of familiar physical laws. And in that crucial moment, God performed this miracle. Jesus' appearance was given to someone else.
Someone else who?
Well, the source suggests it's plausible this person was actually Judas, the betrayer.
So like a case of mistaken identity on the cross. maybe as retribution for Judas.
That's exactly the narrative presented here. The source is very explicit. Jesus himself was not crucified. It claims a traitor was crucified instead. And the true Jesus, according to the source, was lifted into heaven by God and now exists beyond, the dimensions we understand.
Wow. And this narrative gives Jesus a unique future role, too.
It posits that Jesus has this specific destiny, to remain alive in another dimension until he eventually returns to the world.
It's fascinating how this account then pivots to connect Jesus directly to prophecies about Muhammad's arrival.
Yeah, that's a really key link the source makes. It emphasizes that both Moses and Jesus in this narrative foretold the coming of a future prophet. It quotes God telling Moses, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers."
Their brothers.
Oh.
How does the source interpret that?
It interprets brothers as referring specifically to the Ishmaelites who were descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, making them brothers, to the Israelites descended from Isaac. And since Muhammad was an Ishmaelite, well, the connection is made very directly.
I see. And Jesus' prophecy, what does the source quote there?
It quotes Jesus saying something like, "When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. Whatever he hears, he will speak." And this quote is presented directly as a prophecy about Muhammad. So, you see, this source makes a really strong case that these earlier major prophets were specifically pointing towards the next prophet who would come from the line of Ishmael.
That definitely sets the stage powerfully for Muhammad's birth. The source places this in Mecca, describing it as, a thriving trade city.
Yeah, very much so. Dominated by merchants, and their wealth was significantly tied to the whole pilgrimage system centered around the idols in and around the Kaaba.
Right, and then this figure, Abraha al-Ashram, comes along and challenges Mecca's position.
Correct. Abraha, he was the viceroy of Yemen. He wanted to shift the power, the influence, maybe the money too. He built this huge grand church in Yemen, hoping to divert the pilgrimage trade away from Mecca, but people kept favoring Mecca.
So his plan B was more drastic: destroy the Kaaba itself.
Exactly. The source says Abraha put together this massive army, famously including war elephants, which were seen as invincible back then, and marched on Mecca, intending to just demolish the Kaaba.
And the Meccans, what do they do?
Well, the source says they basically saw they couldn't possibly win against that kind of force. So they chose to abandon the city, fled up into the surrounding mountains and hills, leaving the Kaaba seemingly undefended.
Okay, and this is where the source describes some extraordinary divine intervention happening.
Oh, yeah. It describes a series of really inexplicable events. First, as the army got close, the elephants, these huge war elephants, just flat out refused to enter Mecca. They stopped dead, wouldn't move, no matter how hard the soldiers tried to push them forward.
The elephants just stopped. And then came the birds, right? That's in this narrative.
Right. The source says, as if that weren't enough, this enormous swarm of birds suddenly appeared on the horizon, and they started raining down stones carried in their beaks and claws onto Abraha's army.
An entire army defeated by birds and stubborn elephants. That's quite the image.
According to this source, yes. A 60,000-strong army, defeated without any human resistance. The Kaaba and Mecca were saved. And this dramatic event, it's placed just months before Prophet Muhammad was born.
Which gives his birth year its famous name, of course, the Year of the Elephant.
Exactly. He was born in Mecca in that same very memorable year. His early life, though, as the source describes it, was quite difficult. He was orphaned very young. His father, Abdullah, actually died before he was even born, and then his mother, Amina, passed away when he was just a small child.
And the source narrates a whole series of miracles or, supernatural signs happening right around the time of his birth.
Yes, it lists quite a few.
Yeah.
A painless birth for his mother, Amina. The idols inside the Kaaba apparently just fell over on their own. A bright star was seen all the way from Medina. A light supposedly illuminated castles in Syria. The ancient Zoroastrian sacred fire, which had burned for 1,000 years, extinguished. The Persian king's palace reportedly shook and collapsed. Even the Tigris River overflowed its banks. They're all presented as these powerful supernatural signs announcing his arrival. So after these pretty extraordinary events surrounding his birth, the source then looks at his childhood. It mentions the Arab custom of sending infants to foster mothers.
Yeah, outside the city for, better health, right? Who is chosen for Muhammad in this account?
According to the source, it was a woman named Halima Sa'diya, described as someone quite special.
And his presence with her, did it have a significant impact in this telling?
Oh, immensely so, according to the source. It describes his presence bringing incredible blessings and prosperity to her family. Apparently, she'd been quite poor, struggling, but suddenly, everything changed. Luck, abundance. Her milk supply increased dramatically. The land around her home, usually dry, became green and fertile for her animals.
So people noticed.
Yeah, the source says people around her noticed and testified to these blessings that seemed to follow him.
After his mother passed away, who took care of him then?
First, it was his grandfather, Abdul-Muttalib. The source portrays him as the really esteemed leader of Mecca, but also someone who, secretly, believed in the one true God, unlike most people around him worshiping idols. When Abdul-Muttalib got sick, he entrusted young Muhammad to his son, Abu Talib, Muhammad's uncle. And Abu Talib, according to the source, became this deeply caring, very protective guardian.
The source also points to other signs or sort of minor miracles during his childhood.
Yes, it mentions things like a drought suddenly ending when he arrived in an area, or a cloud consistently following him around to shield him from the sun.
A cloud.
Yeah, just for him. And idols sometimes falling over on their own when he was near. These are all presented as these early indicators, showing his special connection with God and hinting at his future mission.
There's a particularly significant story in this narrative about a journey he took to Syria with his uncle Abu Talib.
Right, when he was quite young, maybe between 9 and 12 years old. Their trade caravans stopped near a monastery belonging to a monk named Bahira. The source describes Bahira as this really learned scholar, knew the ancient scriptures inside out, and was actively expecting the arrival of the final prophet, the one to come after Jesus.
And Bahira noticed something unusual about their specific caravan.
Yes, from his monastery window, the source says, Bahira saw this single cloud that was just following their caravan, nobody else's, casting a shadow shielding them. It piqued his curiosity, so he invited the whole caravan for a meal. He was hoping to spot the special person mentioned in his ancient texts.
But initially, he didn't see anyone who fit the description. So he asked if maybe someone was missing.
Exactly. They told him, oh, just the young boy, Muhammad. He stayed back with the luggage. So Bahira insisted they bring him in. And when Muhammad came to the table, the source says Bahira immediately sensed something different about him. He watched him closely and realized all the specific signs, the characteristics described in his ancient scriptures, predicting the final prophet. They were all there, right in front of him, in this young boy.
So this monk, he recognized him purely based on his knowledge of these prophecies.
Yes, and being skilled in Christian scripture, Bahira knew that both Moses and Jesus had foretold a final prophet. The source presents him connecting those prophecies directly to young Muhammad.
And what did Bahira tell Abu Talib then?
The source says he urged Abu Talib really strongly to guard Muhammad carefully, protect him meticulously, because he understood the boy's immense significance.
The source also makes an interesting comparison here, contrasting this with a search happening somewhere else.
It does. It mentions that around this same time, Jewish communities in Medina were also anxiously waiting for a new prophet. They were actively looking for information about Hebrew and Jewish newborns in the area, expecting the prophet to arise from within their lineage.
And they missed Muhammad because he was Arab, even though he had that lineage back to Abraham through Ishmael.
That's precisely the point the source makes. It says their search was focused only on Hebrew and Jewish infants, so they couldn't find him because he was Arab. Despite that direct ancestry back to Abraham via Ishmael, the brothers mentioned in the prophecy, the source even sort of implies this missing him might have been, part of the divine plan somehow.
Okay, so as Muhammad grows up, enters adulthood, the source describes him getting into the merchant world. And he quickly builds this reputation for, exceptional character.
Right. He was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy.
Exactly. His honesty, his integrity, reliability, it earned him that title among the Meccans. Everyone knew him by it.
And this reputation, this character, it led directly to his marriage to Khadija. Yes, Khadija is portrayed as this really successful, wealthy, highly respected businesswoman in Mecca. She also had a title, Al-Tahira, meaning the pure. The source really emphasizes that she was deeply impressed by Muhammad's character, his judgment, his politeness, his generosity, and apparently, even though she had lots of wealthy suitors, she proposed marriage to him.
And the source frames their marriage as really important, a cornerstone for his life and his later mission.
Absolutely. It describes their 25-year partnership. It lasted until she passed away as a time of deep love, trust, respect. It calls it the happiest time of her life. And her unwavering support later on is presented as absolutely crucial for his prophetic work.
Then around the age of 40, the source says his own sort of internal quest for truth really intensified.
Yes, he felt this increasing pull towards belief in the one true God. He showed absolutely no interest in the idols that were everywhere in Meccan society. And driven by this spiritual longing, he started withdrawing, seeking solitude, spending long periods meditating in a cave on Mount Hira.
And it was during one of those retreats in the cave that the very first revelation happened.
That's right. The source describes one night in the cave, he was visited by the angel Gabriel. Gabriel announced that Allah had chosen him, appointed him as a prophet, and the first command was powerful, immediate. Read, "In the name of your Lord who created." And it continues, outlining creation and God's generosity in teaching humanity. That's the start of Surah 96.
And the experience wasn't just in the cave, was it? It continued as he came out.
No, the source says as he emerged, profoundly shaken but also changed, he looked up and saw Angel Gabriel again, this time in a wonderful form, filling the whole horizon. And then apparently everything around him, the leaves, the stones, the trees, the grass, it all seemed to greet him, confirming the immense significance of what had just happened.
He goes home, understandably distressed, overwhelmed, and Khadijah's reaction is highlighted in this narrative.
Yes, the source really focuses on her response. It says she immediately understood the unique divine nature of the experience he'd had. She comforted him, supported him, recognized the sheer intensity of the revelation that had come down upon him.
And then soon after, a second revelation followed.
The source mentions that, yes, another divine message came through, conceptually quoted as, "O you who covers himself, arise and warn the people," which is from Surah 74. And this, the source says, marked the real beginning of his active prophetic mission. A new phase dedicated to spreading the message of divine unity and calling people away from worshiping idols. So after those first incredible moments, the source explains that revelations just kept coming. Delivered by Angel Gabriel, sometimes daily, sometimes at intervals, and gradually, over years, they formed the complete text of the Holy Quran.
How does the source describe the nature of these revelations, and how are they preserved?
It presents them as the direct, literal words of God, often in this incredibly poetic, rhyming verse style, and they were revealed spontaneously, often tied to specific events or questions that arose. Gabriel would transmit the words, the prophet would articulate them, and the source stresses that his companions, his followers, they would immediately memorize these verses and write them down on whatever materials they had, like boards, parchments, shoulder blades.
And this source really holds up the Quran itself as Prophet Muhammad's greatest miracle, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It emphasizes its unique linguistic beauty, its structure, saying it was just beyond the ability of even the most famous poets of the time to imitate or challenge. It essentially silenced them or overwhelmed them with its power.
What were the core teachings that started emerging from these early revelations, according to this source? What was the message?
Well, the source lists several really impactful things. A clear call to abolish cruel forms of slavery, granting significant rights to women, including the right to inherit property, which was apparently revolutionary back then, and this fundamental principle of equality for everyone, regardless of age, status, color.
Equality for everyone.
Yeah, and it even extends this idea of equality to all creatures, mentioning camels specifically as an example of animals deserving fair treatment. But the absolute central command, the foundation of it all, was to worship the one true God, Allah, alone, and completely eliminate idol worship.
And these teachings, unsurprisingly perhaps, created immediate friction, especially with the powerful Meccan merchants.
Oh, absolutely. The source highlights how these new principles directly threatened the existing social structure, but also the economic order in Mecca. They particularly hit the merchants' interest, their income from pilgrims coming to the idols, and the lucrative slave trade. So they were deeply resistant to giving up their customs and actively opposed the growing number of followers.
But despite that strong opposition, people were joining this new community.
Yes, the source says people from all sorts of backgrounds started embracing Islam. They'd declare their faith by saying the Shahada. I bear witness that there is no deity but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Islam is presented here, fundamentally, as being about devotion, conscious submission, surrender to God's will. Okay, so as the Muslim community grows, the source describes the opposition from the idolaters getting well, more intense.
Right. What kind of things were they doing? What forms did this opposition take?
The source mentions escalating hostility. Things like casting evil glances, which sounds maybe symbolic but suggests real ill will, open disrespect towards the believers. And it even says they resorted to things like magic and sorcery trying to harm the prophet or stop the message.
And how did the divine revelations guide the believers through this period, according to the source?
The source explains that God revealed specific instructions, telling the prophet and his followers to seek refuge, seek protection, only in God. It quotes verses from Surah 113, say, I seek refuge in the Lord of daybreak from the evil of that which he created, and so on. Revelations also addressed the deniers directly and reminded believers about the nature of time and loss, like in Surah 103. By time, indeed, mankind is in loss, except for those who believe and do good deeds.
There's a story in the source about the idolaters making a really strange proposal to the prophet around this time.
Yeah, the source calls it impudent, ruthless, and even absurd. Basically, they suggested a compromise. Look, if you worship our gods for 1 year, we'll worship your God for 1 year. Then everyone's happy.
And the divine response, according to the source, was pretty immediate and absolute.
Instantaneous and unequivocal. According to the source, Angel Gabriel came right down with God's words, telling the prophet exactly how to respond, which became Surah 109, say, O disbelievers, I do not worship what you worship. For you is your religion, and for me is my religion. Total rejection of any compromise on worshiping God alone. The source notes that the prophet's firmness, plus the unique poetic power of these revealed words, really perplexed the idolaters.
So, faced with this clear rejection, the source says they then demanded a physical miracle, a really specific one, split the moon.
Yes. They were convinced it was impossible, obviously. They demanded it as the ultimate proof. If he could do that, then maybe he really was a messenger from God.
And according to this source, he did it.
The source recounts that after receiving divine permission, he met the unbelievers one evening, and as everyone watched, he just extended his arm, pointed towards the moon, and, well, the source says, before their eyes, the moon began to shatter and split into 2 distinct halves.
Wow. So how did the idolaters react to seeing
The source is pretty blunt about it. It says their hearts remained unimpressed, hardened. Even after witnessing the moon literally split in 2, they stubbornly refused to believe. They just dismissed it, called it sorcery, magic. The source draws a direct parallel to how earlier disbelievers had dismissed Moses' miracles, like the staff turning into a snake, as just tricks.
But the source includes an account suggesting this event was witnessed far away from Mecca.
It does. It includes a tradition about a king in South India, King Shakirvardi Farmad. He is said to have clearly seen the moon splitting that night, and later, when traders told him about a prophet in Arabia who claimed to have performed this miracle, he investigated, became convinced, and actually converted to Islam.
And this event, according to the source's narrative, had a lasting impact beyond just being a miracle.
The source claims this king's conversion laid the groundwork for the first Muslim communities and enclaves starting up in the Indian subcontinent. It also makes a point of saying that within this telling, the splitting of the moon wasn't the last miracle Prophet Muhammad performed, but just one really significant one among others. So Islam keeps spreading, more people are joining, but the source describes the oppression from the Meccan idolaters getting even worse. They escalated things.
How so? What measures did they take against the Muslims now?
The source talks about a really severe step, a full-scale boycott. They wrote up this decree, sealed it, and actually placed it inside the Kaaba itself. It forbade anyone in Mecca from trading with the Muslims, helping them in any way, or having any social contact at all. It was basically an attempt to starve them out, isolate them completely.
But the source mentions a specific prophecy Muhammad made about that very decree.
Yes, it's quite specific. While he and the believers were enduring real hardship because of this boycott, apparently living in difficult conditions on a mountain path outside Mecca, Prophet Muhammad prophesied that the actual parchment, the decree inside the Kaaba, would be destroyed by worms. And this was a prophecy made while he was outside Mecca, hadn't seen the document since it was sealed.
And was this prophecy validated later, according to the source?
The source says yes. Eventually, word of the prophecy got back to some of the idolaters, and they decided to check the decree inside the Kaaba, and apparently, to their shock, they found the parchment had been almost entirely eaten by worms. All the text detailing the boycott was gone, except for the name Allah, which remained untouched.
Wow. So that proved the prophecy true.
That's how the source presents it, yes, as clear proof. The decree was then declared null and void because of this, but The source adds, the underlying negative attitude, the hostility, it didn't really go away.
Yet, despite all these challenges, the Muslim community kept growing.
Yes, the source states that more followers kept coming, from different tribes even. It emphasizes again the power of the Quranic verses the prophet recited. It says they had this unique ability to touch people's hearts, even hardened ones, and sometimes just the sheer truth and eloquence of the words would silence hostile opponents.
But the tension reached a point where the prophet's own life was in danger in Mecca.
A very serious point. The source describes a plot hatched by the leading idolaters to actually assassinate Prophet Muhammad in Mecca. Faced with this direct, imminent threat, he received a divine revelation instructing him to migrate.
And this is the famous Hijra, the migration to Medina.
Exactly. The source recounts how, one quiet night, the prophet secretly left Mecca with his closest companion, Abu Bakr. And to mislead the would-be assassins, his young cousin Ali bravely volunteered to lie in the prophet's bed as a decoy. When the attackers burst into the house later, they just found Ali, which thwarted their immediate plan.
But they didn't just give up, did they? They pursued Muhammad and Abu Bakr into the desert.
No, they were determined. They sent out skill trackers, wanting to capture them, stop Islam from finding a new base. The source notes the pursuers were getting closer and closer.
And this leads to the famous cave miracle story.
Yes. When the prophet and Abu Bakr realized their pursuers were nearly upon them, they took refuge in a secluded cave. The source says they hid inside there for 3 days.
And what does the source describe happening at the entrance of that cave while they were inside?
It describes this really remarkable act of what it calls divine protection. Overnight, apparently, a dense, perfect spider web appeared right across the cave entrance, looking like it had been there for ages. And right in front of the web, a dove quickly built a nest and was sitting on its eggs.
So when the pursuers finally reached the cave, what did they see? What made them turn away?
Well, when the idolaters got there, the source says they saw the undisturbed dove's nest and this thick, old-looking spider web completely blocking the entrance. They just concluded no one could possibly have gone in there recently without breaking the web or disturbing the bird.
Made sense to them, I suppose?
Right. Convinced the cave was empty, they decided to move on quickly, worried about losing the trail elsewhere.
And the source frames this as God using small creatures for protection.
Yes. It explicitly says God protected his prophet with an army consisting of a dove and a spider along with its web, causing the enemies to make this hasty, wrong decision in the heat of the chase.
And their journey eventually concluded successfully in Medina.
According to the source, yes. The people of Medina had heard he was coming and were eagerly waiting. They gave them this incredibly warm welcome as they finally appeared on the horizon. The source presents this arrival in Medina as a real turning point, the end of the intense persecution in Mecca and the beginning of a whole new era for the Muslim community.
Yeah, this arrival in Medina, it really kicks off a new phase in the narrative. It's all about building a community now.
And the source highlights the mosque construction as a really key early project. Yes, it describes it as this crucial, unifying effort. Everyone pitched in, including the prophet himself doing the physical labor. This mosque became the heart of the new Muslim community, the Ummah, which the source says was founded on that shared belief in the one God and his final prophet.
Life in Medina sounds like it became much more structured around this communal focus.
Definitely. The source mentions the establishment of regular communal prayers in the mosque 5 times a day. Believers gathered there, prayed together, listened to sermons, received teachings directly from the prophet. It became the center of their lives.
Now, Medina was known for having a significant Jewish population at the time. How does the source describe the initial interactions between the Muslims and the Jews there?
The source actually states that the Jewish inhabitants of Medina initially gave the Muslim migrants from Mecca a warm welcome. It even recounts some Jewish individuals approaching the prophet, curious about the God he spoke of, asking him to describe this God.
And that inquiry prompted a specific revelation about God's nature.
Yes, according to the source, it was in response to these questions that God revealed the concise but profound words of Surah 112. Say, He is Allah, the One, Allah, the eternal refuge. He neither begets, nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent.
It feels like the source pauses here, reflects again on how these Quranic revelations actually worked.
It does, yeah. It notes this interesting observation. Sometimes revelations came down seemingly in direct response to events happening on the ground, but other times it almost seemed like events unfolded as if waiting for the divine words to be revealed.
So, which was it?
Well, the source suggests neither perspective fully captures it. Instead, it argues that this dynamic actually demonstrates God's perfection, his timelessness, his independence from, linear time, his presence across past, present, and future simultaneously.
The idea being that the Quran's message already existed, timelessly,
Right.
in God's knowledge.
That's the concept presented. The source states the Noble Quran was already inscribed in God's realm, and its verses were just revealed at the precisely appropriate moments in human history, ensuring their timeless validity and relevance for all ages.
Okay. But meanwhile, back in Mecca, the source indicates the plotting against the Muslims didn't stop just because they'd left.
No, not at all. The Meccan idolaters, they weren't willing to just accept the Prophet's successful escape or the fact that the Muslim community was now growing and gaining influence in Medina. They saw it as a continuing threat and still wanted to eliminate them. The source notes that some occasional raids on Muslim caravans weren't enough to stop their growth.
Which led them to decide on more direct military action against Medina.
Yes, the source says the unbelievers basically concluded the only way to maintain their own power and influence was to try and wipe out the Muslim community in Medina entirely. So they dispatched an army with that goal.
Now, up to this point, the source has been emphasizing that Muslims were actually forbidden from fighting back physically, right?
Yeah. Correct. It stresses that the Prophet had consistently held his followers back from armed retaliation, even when they were being persecuted in Mecca. But now, with this army marching on Medina, the very existence of the community was threatened. And it's at this point, the source says, that a crucial revelation came down, granting permission for self-defense.
How does the source articulate that permission?
It conceptualizes it based on verses like Surah 22.39, stating something to the effect of, permission to fight has now been given to those who are being fought against because they were wronged, those who were evicted from their homes unjustly, only because they said, "Our Lord is Allah." This marked a huge shift, lifting that prior prohibition and specifically allowing Muslims to use force for defense in this life-or-death situation. So this permission to fight for self-defense, it really starts a new chapter in the source's narrative.
And the first major battle mentioned is the Battle of Badr.
Yes. The source recounts this pivotal battle, where the Muslims, though significantly outnumbered and less equipped, faced the Meccan army. It attributes the Muslim victory largely to God's direct support, combined with good strategy. It's described as a really stunning victory that shocked the idolaters.
The source also makes a point of addressing some specific verses in the Quran about fighting, verses that are often, brought up or maybe misunderstood.
Yes, this is something the source seems keen to clarify. It explicitly addresses verses like Surah 9.5, which contains phrases like, "Slay the idolaters wherever you find them." The source insists these verses were revealed and applied only to a specific group of idolaters who had repeatedly broken treaties and were actively attacking and harming the Muslims at that particular historical juncture.
So the source is arguing for a very specific, limited historical context for those verses, not a general command.
Absolutely. It lays out this clear teaching. The Quran has verses relevant to wartime situations and verses for peacetime. It argues strongly that those wartime verses only become applicable if Muslims face genuinely similar circumstances of severe aggression and persecution requiring defense. Otherwise, the source says the peacetime verses promoting compassion, forgiveness, and peace are always the recommended standard.
What about the Prophet's own conduct during these conflicts? What does the source emphasize?
The source asserts that he only ever resorted to armed conflict when he had divine permission, strictly for defensive purposes, and only after all peaceful options and diplomatic efforts had been completely exhausted.
Did he introduce any rules or principles for how warfare should be conducted, according to the source?
Yes, this is presented as a really significant contribution. The source highlights that the Prophet issued clear instructions, things like respecting churches and synagogues, other places of worship, forbidding any harm to women, children, or the elderly, prohibiting the destruction of trees, crops, or harming nature unnecessarily.
So rules of engagement, essentially.
Pretty much. The source presents these as groundbreaking principles of warfare, almost like early international law, introduced centuries before similar concepts formally developed elsewhere. It uses this to showcase his reformist approach, his compassion, even in the midst of conflict.
Despite allowing for defense, the source emphasizes that the actual time spent fighting over his entire prophetic career was relatively short.
Yes, it makes a point of stating that Prophet Muhammad engaged in warfare for a total of only about 2 months across his entire 23 years as a prophet. Battles are sometimes framed in the narrative as lessons or tests for the Muslim community, and the source mentions God sometimes intervening with unexpected miracles to help them.
The path to the final victory, the conquest of Mecca, seems to start with a broken agreement.
That's how the source presents it. There was a ceasefire agreement, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, between the Muslims and the Meccan idolaters. The source says the idolaters violated this treaty, and that action set in motion the events leading to the Muslims eventually returning to Mecca.
Which culminates in the conquest of Mecca itself. How is that described?
The source narrates the prophet setting out towards Mecca with a large force. It mentions 10,000 men. But crucially, they entered the city peacefully in the month of Ramadan. Mecca was conquered without any fighting or bloodshed.
And then came a very symbolic act, the cleansing of the Kaaba from idols.
Yes, a really pivotal moment in the narrative. The source emphasizes the prophet personally entering the Kaaba. He then struck the idols that were housed inside with his staff while reciting the Quranic verse that had been revealed for this moment. Truth has come and falsehood has departed. Indeed is falsehood ever bound to depart. That's Surah 17.81.
And what happened to the idols when he did that?
The source says that just with a gentle touch from his staff, the idols tumbled down, broke apart, almost as if they were just waiting to fall. It's presented as this incredibly powerful symbol. The end of superstition, falsehood, evil, oppression, all falling away, and the restoration of the pure worship of the one God in the Kaaba, bringing it back to its original purpose as established by Abraham. The source concludes this part by stating God had now destined and perfected the religion of Islam for all humanity through his final prophet, Muhammad. Okay, so after the conquest of Mecca, the source then sort of zooms out again, placing Islam within this broader context of religious history, presenting it as the final perfected religion.
It starts by clarifying the name for God, Allah.
Yes, it makes the point that the name Allah wasn't actually new with the Quran. It states that this name, or something very similar like Elo in the Old Testament Torah, is essentially a timeless name for God that's reflected across various Semitic languages, maybe with slight differences in pronunciation over time.
And Islam is presented as the culmination of this long divine message.
That's the claim presented here, that Islam was intended by God to be the final and complete religion for all humanity, and the Quran is the conclusive final divine book, meant to succeed and, from the source's perspective, correct the previous scriptures.
Why the need to replace or correct earlier scriptures, according to this source's view?
Well, the source presents the claim, and it's important to stress this is the claim within this source, that earlier divine books, like parts of the Bible, had been tampered with and altered by people over the centuries after the original prophets had passed away.
And the Quran, in contrast, is presented as
the unaltered, divinely protected guide, offering clarity and a way out of what the source sees as confusion resulting from those alleged corruptions in earlier texts. It's positioned as this single unified book that is exclusively the verbatim word of God, unlike it argues other scriptures.
Right. The source seems to draw a very clear distinction between how it views the Bible versus the Quran on this point.
It does. It describes the Bible as, essentially, a collection of different books, writings, letters, compiled by various human authors over a long period. It specifically claims the Old Testament part, up to Moses, was altered. And the New Testament, it argues, consists of writings by people like Paul, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all composed after Jesus' time, not necessarily his direct words.
And Jesus' own role is defined quite specifically within this narrative, not as someone starting a new religion or a new Bible.
That's exactly the interpretation the source offers. It states Jesus' main mission was to warn the Jews of his era and call them back to the original commandments of the Torah that it claims they had altered. It argues strongly that concepts like Christ, the Trinity, the Son of God, as they later developed in Christianity, actually emerged decades or even centuries after Jesus, and according to this source, weren't part of his original core message.
How does the source refer to the very first followers of Jesus? Does it use the term Christians?
Interestingly, no. It points out that the Quran refers to them as Nasara, which translates to Nazarenes or followers of Jesus of Nazareth. The source suggests that the terms Christianity and Christians came later, reflecting how the religion evolved after Jesus, whereas the Quran uses the term associated with his immediate followers from his hometown.
Okay, so the overarching conclusion the source presents here is that Islam represents the pure, original essence of all the previous authentic monotheistic religions.
Yes, exactly. And that the Quran is the final, complete, and importantly unaltered summary of all those original divine messages. And therefore, Prophet Muhammad is presented as the seal of all the prophets and messengers, signifying the completion and the perfection of Islam as God's ultimate religion for all humankind.
Finally, the source brings its narrative to a close with the end of Prophet Muhammad's life on earth.
It states that he passed away 2 years after that peaceful conquest of Mecca at the age of 63.
And it notes the very last verse of the Quran that was revealed before his passing.
Yes, the source quotes it as being from Surah 2, verse 2781, "And fear a day when you will be returned to Allah. Then every soul will be compensated for what it earned, and they will not be treated unjustly." A final reminder, essentially. Wow, okay, that source really does take us on an incredible sweep through history, doesn't it? Presenting this very detailed, very specific narrative about prophethood, divine intervention, and how a major world religion developed, all seen through its particular lens.
It's fascinating how it connects all these figures, Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, in what it presents as this single, unbroken lineage leading straight to Muhammad, and placing the Kaaba right at the start, tracing its history through floods and rebuilding.
Yeah, and it definitely puts a huge emphasis on those remarkable events, the year of the elephant, the splitting of the moon, the miracles during the migration. And it presents the Quran not just as scripture, but as Muhammad's greatest miracle, uniquely unaltered, the direct word of God.
Right. And it offers that very distinct interpretation of the history of earlier scriptures and how they relate to the Quran, framing Islam as the final culmination, correcting what it presents as later human alterations in previous texts. It's definitely a specific viewpoint on that whole history.
Absolutely. So this deep dive into this specific source really gives us a structured way to understand its particular telling of Prophet Muhammad's life and the origins of Islam, all within its presented context of earlier prophets, divine planning, and constant miracles.
It certainly provides a lot to think about and process. Considering everything laid out in this source material, what specific part of this narrative, or maybe what concept is told by the source, stands out most to you?
For me, it might be the sheer consistency of the theme of divine intervention and protection. It seems like at almost every single crucial turning point described right from the Kaaba's founding, through the challenges, the miracles like the moon splitting or the cave incident, right up to the peaceful conquest, the source argues that the entire history was being meticulously guided, shielded, and directed by God's direct, active hand.
That idea that God's direct action is presented as shaping literally every key moment in this specific narrative, that is a compelling thought to ponder, especially coming from this source's perspective. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope exploring this particular source gave you some valuable insights into its specific telling of this profound history.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. I hope you've gained some valuable insights. If you're a truth seeker, yearning for divine light and ready to step out of darkness, now is your moment. The truth is that Allah is the one and only creator of the universe. He has sent over 124,000 messengers and prophets to guide humanity, starting with Adam and culminating with the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them all. If you resonate with this message, you might be ready to embrace Islam. Simply recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. For further support, feel free to join our WhatsApp group. You can send us a private message there. The link is in the video description. Don't wait until it's too late. We look forward to connecting with you soon.